And so we've come at last to the last written Poirot novel. The much beloved Elephants Can Remember. Actually, no, though. Before I even started this book, I was vaguely aware that it was not one to expect much from. I mean, really not to expect much from at all. I'm not sure why. It might just be that I've never seen this mentioned among anyone's favorite Poirot novels and have frequently seen it towards the bottom of people's lists. But sometimes in the recent novels, I've been pleasantly surprised or even just found bits to enjoy, even if they're not among the very best novels. And this book does not meet that standard. This novel stinks to the core. There may be some semblance of a good idea with the elephants theme, but it just doesn't even come close to a convincing execution. In fact, I'm going to come right out and say it right here at the beginning. This is the worst Poirot novel I've reviewed, even worse than Hercule Poirot's Christmas. A novel which I rag on a lot and seemed disappointing at the time, but honestly, if I revisited it, it might come out more favorably on my second opinion. In fact, I think the only novel that could compete with it in my mind for the title of absolute worst Poirot novel will be The Big Four, which I haven't actually read yet to completion, but I will. I'm actually going to read that one next before moving on, and I'm going to keep an open mind about that one since I now know what not to expect. I don't expect anything remotely like a typical Poirot mystery from that one. I expect more of a series of short stories. Anyway, besides the point. The gimmick in Elephants Can Remember is that we're looking into a crime, or possibly multiple crimes from the past, in which no one at the center of the story seems to remember anything about. That's it. That is the premise. And while I suppose I can imagine an interesting story involving tracking down these metaphorical elephants who can shed light on the details of this tragic double killing, in this novel it makes for extremely tedious reading. Not being able to remember things is a key problem in this novel, and I mean not just being unable to remember details about the central mystery, but also hemming and hawing about forgetting the most banal trivialities like what someone's postal address is. Much of the story is told following the perspective of the wonderful mystery writer Ariadne Oliver, whose by nature has always been very scattered, but this is a different level. In this novel, she's constantly messing up names and details in a way that even if people do this in reality, I believe it, it has no place in this mystery novel. Poirot confesses to having some memory trouble as well, although the reader can interpret whether this is really true or if he's just being kind to his old friend Miss Oliver. And I realize declining memory abilities are something real that happens and that real people do deal with, especially in old age. One can surmise from the fact that it was so much on the forefront of Agatha Christie's mind that she was probably very conscious of some cognitive decline on her own part. This novel was published when she was nearing the end of her life, after all. But with full respect to the author herself, in a mystery novel where the people closest to the actual crime can't remember anything about it, can't even remember who the people were that were involved and how they were related to one another, and worse, in which we have to read page upon page, character upon character, waffling back and forth about how they couldn't be certain if it was Molly that was her name or was it Dolly. Okay, that's actually another aspect that could be fine here, but I think just adds to the confusion. There are twin sisters here named Molly and Dolly. And yes, I just said twins. There's going to be twins in this novel, and that always creates some very interesting but not really interesting possibilities. All right, where was I? Imperfect recollections are expected in a mystery novel, and real people do sometimes take a while before getting to the point. They take some time to remember details. But this isn't something that usually is captured in perfect fidelity in the writing because it doesn't really add anything, at least not when used to the excess that it's used here. It almost feels like it was left there as filler because this novel was one of the shorter Poirot novels. The audiobook came in at 5 hours and 30 minutes, making it about as short as they get. And yet it still felt like it dragged. And again, all respect to Agatha Christie, I'm sure it's not easy for everyone to just keep cranking out stellar novels into their 80s, I think. But this novel, more than probably any other I've read by her, feels like it was rushed to publication and just lacks even basic editing. Plus, I don't know if it was just me, but for related reasons, I found the mystery itself extremely hard to follow, at least for the first half of the book when we're listening to the stories from elephants, because we're jumping around between multiple distant memories of things that we don't know anything about yet, and that took place at different times that easily could be misconstrued to be talking about the exact same time. Like, there was a baby that was thrown into a river by his sister, or was it his mother? Actually, was he thrown into a river, or did his sister mother kill him with a garden tool when he was a young boy? Or am I mixing up two different events here? I actually didn't really figure this out even by the end of the book. Can you see why this is such a frustrating mystery? Maybe all of this is being a little unfair. Maybe there is a way that this memory haze concept could have been executed more adroitly. The problem, though, is that there's very little else in this novel to make up for it. There's basically no setting to speak of. Pretty much the most descriptive imagery we get is that the house of the victims was situated on the edge of a cliff and was called Overcliff, so I guess that's the quality of description that we're getting in this book. There's also some talk about events that happened a while ago in Malaya, the British colony, but aside from that being mentioned and there being an Amma involved in one of the characters' recollections, there's really nothing here to evoke the reader's imagination. And the rest of the story is just all conversation, dull conversation taking place in nondescript parlor rooms. This is simply not on the same level as even a recent Poirot novel like, say, Third Girl, in which we get to follow Ariadne Oliver on a dangerous pursuit through a shady area of town where she's suddenly caught on the head, and in which even the description of the apartment building the three girls lived in appeared more vividly than anything in this book. And I mentioned that apartment was like the dullest, most drab sort of building, but that was descriptive and set the scene. Really, the only thing that sticks in my mind after reading this book is the imagery of elephants. Because, oh my goodness, I know Christie always loved her gimmicks, and they were often a little cheesy and forced even at the best of times, but this one just keeps coming back again and again, and pretty much every character who enters this scene has to be brought to remember, along with the reader, what it is that elephants can do. They can remember. They have really good memories, apparently. You see, they don't forget things because they remember. Actually, the worst crime of this constant reminding of what elephants do is that, unlike some of the really forced titles Christie has used, this one actually, in theory, could have worked. I've already mentioned that the implication that we have to track down a bunch of people who really can't remember anything for the reader to follow along in high fidelity does not work so well here, but I think there is a distant world in which this book with this title and central concept of sort of hazy memory could have worked. I mean, there's plenty of movies and thrillers that get into this concept of hazy memory in an effective way. Okay, after all that bashing, before I get on to the spoilers for some more bashing, one other thing that was actually kind of good about this book. The first chapter, in which Ariadne Oliver attends a writer's luncheon and muses about her experiences and attitudes. This was actually really enjoyable, and it set me up for thinking this novel might not be so bad. But don't be fooled, because it is not representative of the quality or the characterization throughout any of the rest of this novel. Okay, let's get into the spoilers, though this is one of those rare cases that's a misnomer, because you might actually be better off just knowing what happens so you don't spoil a few hours of your day reading this book. Did I solve this mystery? Not exactly, but I'm not sure if it was just because I was too bored to be following along correctly. There were certainly some glaring clues that honestly I'd have to say were not the best clues because they were just too obvious or recycled from other stories that Christie's already used. The fact that there were twins probably had everyone guessing that there could have been some switching of places or confusion as to which twin was which. This is especially true once we have some, in my opinion, rather obvious clues and thrown in multiple times about the dog biting its mistress, implication being this isn't the dog's actual mistress, as well as the persistent clue of the 4 wigs. Now, as for the 4 wigs, I'd have to give it the honor of being the most intriguing and puzzling clue of the clues in the story. So if you were able to fully piece together the reason for the 4 wigs, I think that is worth celebrating. But even the 4 wigs, rather than revealing some additional aspect of the mystery, ultimately are pointing to the same trope. Someone is pretending to be someone they're not. The irony being that here it was a twin pretending to be her identical twin, so this is theoretically so much easier than some of the switcheroos we've seen pulled off in Christie's earlier works. And I hardly even need to mention that although twins can be used successfully in novels, they're kind of the epitome of the too easy solution that's usually laughed off from the start by the detective, who's too clever to buy that as an explanation. Which you could argue doesn't quite apply here since we're told there are twins involved, but again, it takes so painfully long with so much beating around the bush to get to the fact that there are twins here that I can't really even concede the point because the twins thing here is actually treated as some big reveal a little ways through the book. In fact, if there was anything that threw me off in terms of hard evidence, not in terms of the convoluted writing style, I think it was this character, Mrs. Burton Cox. It's hinted from the beginning that it's very important to figure out why she's interested in knowing who killed whom. And I have to say I was puzzled by that and couldn't really come up with any good theories for it. But then the actual explanation for it turns out to be only a half explanation in the end anyway. Nothing really all that clever. She was just trying to stir up trouble to prevent this marriage of her son in any way she could so that she could still have access to her adopted son's money. As for the solution actually involving one of the sisters being a mentally deranged killer, that was a rather unwelcome surprise to me too. Certainly we often have suggestions in Christie's novels that a psychotic killer is on the loose and responsible for a murder, but that is always meant to be a dismissed suggestion by the reader. Like, that's a policeman level suggestion. Throughout this novel, I was expecting to eventually hear a mildly more interesting explanation at the end about how the sister appeared to be psychotic but really wasn't. For example, we got something like this in a recent novel involving drugs as the explanation. But when the actual reveal came, I found it incredibly lackluster. In fact, even the reveal scene in this novel has got to be one of the, probably the worst, most half-hearted revelations in the entire Poirot chronology. I hadn't even put together the full solution, and as soon as Poirot says it without much fanfare or ado on his part, which is out of character in itself, I simply think, yep, sure, good story. Maybe I should have expected this, because I forgot to mention this earlier in the spoiler-free section, but Poirot himself, multiple times earlier in the book, states that this case is probably just best left alone. Not because it's dangerous or is stirring up the mud, but it's just he's bored by it. His decision to eventually follow through feels like one of compulsion more than of general interest. It's clear that Poirot, too, at this point, is ready for his actual retirement, sadly. And going back to the psychotic rage aspect of the solution, I'm not saying it's impossible or that this couldn't happen. It just feels unsatisfying within the context of a Christie novel. I mean, for another thing, yes, some people actually do suffer from psychosis, but for most it probably doesn't manifest either in the way it does in this book, so this plot isn't really doing a whole lot for the understanding of mental illness either. It just seems to be confirming erroneous myths and stereotypes rather than dispelling them or further explaining them. But also just feels unsatisfying as a solution, because the psycho killer explanation comes up in every book, and we're never meant to take it seriously. It's like an Inspector Japp solution, not a Poirot level solution. So, if you haven't figured out this mystery by now, I didn't like this book. I'd rank it at the very bottom among every Christie novel I've read. Nevertheless, although I don't see many people saying this book is their favorite, it doesn't seem to be unanimously chosen as people's least favorite, so some readers may find more to like in it than I did. So let me know if you're one of those readers and where you disagree with me, because we all experience literature in different ways, and I am genuinely curious as to how this novel appealed to other readers. So next up, it's The Big Four. Yes, I know this isn't really the next book in the series, but it's the one book that I skipped on my first pass through because after getting about a quarter of the way through, I just realized it wasn't going to be the type of Poirot novel I was looking for at the time, so I resolved to come back to it later. Much later. Much, much later. I don't have super high hopes for it, but I think that's a good thing because really all it can do now is pleasantly surprise me in one way or another. And then I will be finally ready to take on the final Poirot novel, Curtain. Definitely looking forward to that one. I haven't technically finished every other Poirot story because a few of the short stories have still eluded me for now, but I made my way through enough of them that I think I'm finally ready for the grand finale. Happy reading, and remember that elephants can remember.